You ready? Good morning, everybody. Dick. Okay, so welcome to the second session of Oauth. We have 90 minutes, so we don't have the full 2.5 hours, only the first 90 minutes. So this is the note well. If you're not familiar with this, make sure to look at it. Everything you say and contribute is still under that note well. Thanks to Dan for being our Java scribe, and for Tony for volunteered to be a minute taker. And here are our blue sheets. Oh, blue sheets. Blue sheets will be. And here's our schedule for the day. So Hannes will start talking about POP tokens. He has 15 minutes to do that. Then Dick will talk about distributed Oauth, and at the end, John will talk about security BCP. Any bash for this agenda? Any comment about this? Okay, let's get going.
Yep. Test. So we'll see whether it takes 15 minutes to discuss this. May take 2 hours.
There.
Well, let's see.
You drive.
Okay. That's what, so. Who of you doesn't remember the Bob token work? Oh man. I mean, who does not? You guys remember, right? No. Okay, but I will very briefly go through this. So that the story was, and you see that sort of manifested in the different documents, is that, and particularly also in the ACE OAuth. So it's a little bit of an ACE OAuth high-level introduction, if you will. See it that way, then. We had these two slightly different patterns for symmetric versus asymmetric keys. Start with the symmetric key version first. When the client talks to the authorization server to get the access and the refresh token, it made that request and indicated that it wants. I should point over here. It wants a symmetric key version, and there are a few parameters that are passed along, which I will describe in subsequent slides. But the important part is that the token comes back, a POP token comes back, and along with it, keys that are sent from the authorization server to the client for use by the client. The access token itself also has keys. It's a POP token after all, but those are in sort of like. They are, so this is the usual POP token, so it's actually consumed only by the resource server, but in the symmetric key solution, the symmetric key has to be sort of carried encrypted in that payload. And we have the data structures defined for doing so. In OAuth, we had all this, the work with the JSON web token, and then the corresponding POP token extension has been long done. And we are about to finish, so if you attended the ACE session this week, you saw the discussion about finishing the POP token extension for the CWD, the CBOR web token. Okay, Brian? The asymmetric version is a little slightly different because the client doesn't need to have the authorization server generate the public-private key pair, but instead the client just tells the authorization server what public key to include in the POP token, and that's described here. And we use the same mechanisms for doing so. And there's the access token in this case just contains the public key or fingerprint of it, and there's nothing that needs to be sent back from the authorization server to the client because the client already has the public and private key. Okay, and then of course then the client, when it talks to the resource server, it has to use the POP token and demonstrate possession of the key, and it does this in a variety of different ways. And specifically in the work done in ACE, there are different ways defined to tie it to a specific security protocol. There's a DTLS-based version, there's a OSCORE version, and so on and so on. Okay. So unless, in comparison to Oauth, where we had this struggle with the HTTP signing in the core working group, people came up with this, the OSCORE mechanism to protect various headers and payloads for co-op, and we had that presentation a few IETFs ago. That group also believed that they have come up with a solution for HTTP. But that's a separate topic that I don't want to go through here now. So what's the status of all of this? So in the ACE OAuth specification, there's a framework document which builds on OAuth, as the name indicates, and it uses the POP token functionality only. It doesn't use bearer tokens. And it also has points to the CWD instead of the JWD for efficiency reasons. And as I mentioned earlier, there are also other protocols used than HTTP. We have also worked on other protocols in OAuth other than HTTP. If you remember the SASL GSS API for email, that was a little longer ago. It was actually, wasn't done in OAuth, but done under the supervision of OAuth. In any case, in one of the so there are different use cases, and there's a longer use case document available in ACE that tells what you could use the whole framework for. But one of the use cases is where the client, for example, is a smartphone or tablet that talks to an IoT device to control it, to configure it, and to do something. And the client, the OAuth client, uses HTTP to talk to the authorization server, just a regular OAuth authorization server that supports POP token usage. And instead of, since the authorization server can issue tokens with different types, it can, in this case, for performance reasons, can issue CWD POP tokens. But then as the client gets all this stuff, it passes it on to the IoT device, for example, using co-op or some of the other IoT related protocols like MQTT. And so the current status is that in that document, which is going to enter working group last call fairly soon, I think Jim said in September, it defines parameters for that exchange with the POP tokens, and I'm going to talk about the parameters in a second. It defines them for co-op and HTTP to cover those different use cases. So that text is there, and some of it has been taken from, at that time, expired key distribution, POP key distribution document that we had in our working group. Additionally, it turns out that the WebRTC guys, they have also defined the token format. It was once sent for review to the list. So they have a binary encoding that is not CBOR. At that time, I think CBOR wasn't finalized, or doesn't matter. So they have a separate Bob token format. And of course, OAuth allows different formats. So that's perfectly fine. And we did a review of that. And they use this with their Stern firewall traversal technology. Great. So more usage in this WebRTC real-time communication on the web mechanism. And I provided a little bit more details of that work also and pointers in the link you can see on the screen. In any case, what that means is that we are trying to, at least in 2 different groups outside OAuth, trying to finish the Bob token work, which was in this working group a little bit underappreciated, at least with respect to that document. We have worked on other Bob token solutions. So it turns out I tried to update the documents with the help of my co-authors and get them in line with what the latest status is. And it turns out that we ran into 3 issues which I would like to get some guidance on from the working group to actually then execute those changes. I didn't want to surprise you all with suddenly totally different documents. And the 3 issues, I believe, maybe there are others. The HTTP-based parameters, which were previously in the OAuth document, are now in the ACE document. Is that something you guys are comfortable with, or where should they go? Should they go back into the OAuth group? And I will talk a little bit more about this. The other one is there's some misalignment between what's in the Bob token distribution document and what's in the ACE OAuth document. There are different parameters used, and maybe one is better than the other, or maybe both are equally fine. We'll talk about those things. And then finally, there's a question about the encoding of the key transport. Those are the main issues I have, and happy to hear others as well. Let me very briefly summarize, in case you haven't read the ACE OAuth document recently, the couple of parameters defined. And I mentioned the first one in previous OAuth working group meetings. There's one, the audience parameter. And as the name indicates, and we had discussions and contributions and drafts in this working group before, this parameter is useful when you, for example, in the symmetric key solution, when the client wants to tell the authorization server what the target of that communication is going to be, which resource server am I going to send this token finally to, because the authorization server needs to have that information in order to encrypt the symmetric key that goes into the CWD Bob token. Otherwise, it doesn't know how to do that unless it uses some other mechanism. So, but that's where we use that parameter. The second parameter is this confirmation parameter, which is used to carry the keys from the authorization server to the client, and also to provide some, I think, parameters to the public key fingerprint from the client to the authorizations onto the authorization server. There's also one other parameter that you may not have seen before. This is called rs_cnf. This parameter gives the client information about the raw public key to be used by the resource server. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this one any further, but just to let you know, there's a conf CNF and the rs_cnf in case it's confusing.
Yes, chat question from Phil Hunt. I think the block in the OAuth working group is the final step, how to do message authentication. HTTP request signing seems impossible. Hannes, are there techniques from the other groups that could be applied more generally?
Yes, so in the ACE working group, the focus is obviously not on HTTP. So there are other protocols used in the IoT context where solutions have been worked out on how this request signing looks like. And Ludwig, maybe you can elaborate on that. But the mechanism that was defined for co-op is apparently also applicable to other protocols that use a RESTful paradigm, including HTTP. That's what the presentation was about some IETFs ago when this topic was brought up on the mailing list. You may remember. I can post a link again to the presentation.
Ludwig Seitz. But there's also in ACE, the DTLS profile, which defines how to use these confirmation keys in the DTLS handshake in order to prove the possession of these keys. And I would guess that this is applicable for TLS as well. I mean, there was a draft in Oauth by Samuel and me recently saying how we did that. And there was not a lot of interest in it, so we dropped that. But basically, I assume that the stuff we do with DTLS is really, really easy to transfer to TLS.
A couple of observations from the token binding work, making changes to the TLS stack and exposing the EKM and all of the other things that might be easier in other newer environments is really, really hard to impossible. So if, it probably reusing token binding, which is already going through all the pain of exposing those additional parameters, maybe, is a way of doing it. And we already have work going on that. The other thing, Brian and I put out a draft on resource, which replaced audience. We discovered that in practice, audience AUD as a parameter to the token endpoint is really, really problematic. So yes, we need the parameter. It's just don't call it audience. That it causes all sorts of issues once you start sending a JOT to authenticate, which has an audience, which is it the audience of the resource server in the JOT or the audience that's supposed to be the token endpoint, and just we need a different name.
So you suggest to call it resource?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay.
That proposal was. Calling this audience will cause endless confusion.
Okay.
So yes, we need the parameter. That's just a really bad name, as it turned out.
And John, so since that parameter has been defined in the ACE working group, which is defined for both HTTP as well as co-op as a parameter, do you see that as a problem?
Yeah, basically you can't generically use that because the parameter already exists for the token endpoint in some of the authentication methods for at the authorization, at the token endpoint.
Different.
Well, if we're
I was after something different. Do you see that if we change the name of the parameter to resource in the ACE OAuth specification, it would be applicable to both co-op and HTTP? Would you consider that as a problem? So this was actually not one of the issues I thought it would be an issue, but
Brian Campbell, I think that is potentially a problem because it has completely different semantics in ACE. So and there's only one registry, so I would prefer that it doesn't get used up.
Why is that a different semantic? If the client does switch the authorizations or which
so I haven't read it all,
server.
but when I read it, it was a CBOR encoded thing.
Well, it's a CBOR encoded thing for the co-op when it's transported over co-op, but I don't remember what the encoding is for HTTP. So there are different encodings for different protocols.
I may have read it wrong. It read very much the parameter definition read to me like it was CBOR to the authorization server. Which
We changed that at some point through the lifetime of the document. So, but the intention is to have, or
Okay.
All of those parameters that I'm talking about, they are encoded differently depending on whether they go on HTTP versus they go on co-op.
Okay, my mistake then. Apologies.
So assuming we can sort that out, resource would be better than audience.
Okay.
Yes, if that was your question.
No, my question was, do you see a problem if we define this in the ACE OAuth document also for HTTP as well as co-op?
Again, it probably depends on whether, the problem with having it in co-op is that other things, people may not find it, etc., as part of OAuth. I'm not violently opposed to having it defined there, but that may confuse people and or cause it to be attempted to be reinvented any number of times. It may be better to define it as a separate spec in OAuth, because we have a whole bunch of things in OAuth that are going to want to use that. This isn't the only use case for that parameter. So it's not unique to POP tokens.
No, it's
Right.
in the way how the parameters defined
Right.
is more generic. It just
Right.
says
So-
just says this is the resource I'm going to talk to.
So the identifier, that particular parameter probably deserves its own document so that it's easily referenceable from other OAuth specs. Burying it down in a co-op document, maybe,
In an ACE OAuth document.
or ACE,
Oh.
right? So we don't need to sort that out now
Well,
particularly,
actually,
but
we do.
Okay.
We really do, because
Then if we're sorting it out now, I would say, for the sake of clarity, let's put that parameter in its own document, because again, it's been attempted to be defined at least 3 or 4 times. There was a
Yeah.
standalone document on it in the OAuth working group.
right, and that's actually the downside, because we, as I mentioned earlier, the plan is to go to working group last call in September, whereas this has been worked on in OAuth for whatever reason because of different objections, like for years, and it would be unfortunate if then there's this dependency that where we stall things, etc.
Well,
That's also
if-
something to take into account.
If the 2 people that objected to it last time aren't objecting to it now, then perhaps we could do this relatively quickly.
Who was the one? Oh, the meeting minute.
And-
Uh-huh. Phil?
I didn't say his name.
Yeah. Tony, what do you think about this? Phil, do you have an opinion about this? Do you want to briefly speak about this topic? What is your sense now a few years into that discussion?
He may have gone back to his nap. No, he's awake.
It's in the middle of the day for him.
No, it's more early morning in Vancouver. Oh, that's where he is.
Did you push the button?
Phil, yeah. Can you hear us? We can't hear you. Supposed to be speaking.
Yeah, it says he's speaking, but
We can't hear you, Phil.
Phil, you may need to unmute. Okay.
He didn't object except for signing.
Oh, okay.
Which is a separate issue.
Which is a separate issue. Yeah. Tony, you want to come to the mic?
Tony Nadlin, I don't believe it's a separate issue. It could be an orthogonal issue, but I think we have to figure this out at the same time. I don't think you can agree to this and say signing, we're gonna totally forget about it this time.
Well, we are talking about a specific spec for adding a resource parameter to the token endpoint. We could ignore it and allow ACE to define it for us. I'm sure that you would see that as a preferred option.
I think, Tony, the question is not whether we are going to define that parameter and register it. I think we are past that point. That decision has been made. The question is, which document will it go? And there are two choices.
Yeah,
There's a
the-
separate OAuth document, or there's the ACE OAuth document.
Yeah, and I'd rather see it in the OAuth, separate OAuth document.
Thank you, Tony.
So I think that's a better choice. But I didn't understand John's point about token binding. Are you?
That was a
I know, but it bothers me.
Many things bother you. The point is that if we're going to have a presentment mechanism that's going to start messing with the TLS transport, we already have a presentment
this.
mechanism.
Okay.
We should focus on that rather than trying to invent
A new
a
one.
new
Okay.
But that-
HTTP.
But that
Presentment
decision also
mechanism.
has been made already. So,
Well, no,
not in
you were just talking about, well, maybe maybe ACE ought to if ACE is looking at doing a new presentment mechanism over HTTP, then perhaps they ought to look at
No, we are not-
using token binding rather
It's-
than
it's
some
not
new
using.
TLS bound
Yeah.
mechanism.
It's not. ACE is not defining a new presentment mechanism over HTTP. What it does is it uses the keys as one of the possibilities. The keys in the DTLS handshake to protect co-op. Okay.
Okay, so this is DTLS specific.
There's a document that talks
Right.
about how to do
So-
that with DTLS and co-op.
Right, so we ought not to worry about applying
Jim,
that
you're
to
shaking-
TLS
you-
because we already have a mechanism for that, is my point.
Yeah, for HTTP.
For DTLS,
that's
that's fine, yes.
Okay, so good. We resolved that issue. That was.
I would expect it to be perfectly, I would expect it to be used in doing co-op over TLS too. That's the same mechanism as DTLS.
That's fine. Or at least I would expect it to work as well.
I mean, it's going to be this, it's, from an API point of view,
The same.
it is identical.
Yeah.
Some time ago, Brian Campbell wrote draft Campbell OAuth resource indicators.
I was co-author of it.
And I think John was too.
Yeah,
This already solves the problem.
I fully agree.
I
with you.
think that we should now adopt that as a working group document and finish it.
So there may be some stuff that from the other co-op ACE document around encoding for other transports that we want to pull into it, but
Yeah.
that should be fairly quick work.
Yeah, I mean, Brian's already done the heavy lifting. We should just use it. And I don't know when the chairs want to call that question, but there seems to be a lot of people in the room who, including yourself, who think that we need this parameter, and it's already written down.
Yeah. So maybe we could. So maybe you can get a sense
Yeah.
of the room,
Yeah, just
or let
first-
the queue.
Yeah, let's finish the queue.
Jim Shaw. I'm having a problem understanding John's position on the using the name audience. My understanding is that this is basically designed to be equivalent to the audience in a CWT or a JWT.
But this is
So using a different name seems odd.
I'm not saying use it as a different name in the access token. I'm saying that as a request parameter where it conflicts with the audience. So when you're making a request to the token endpoint, adding an extra parameter that says audience, which is actually the identifier for the resource server, that audience and the audience of your request conflict once you put them in a JOT and send it as a, that is one of
So
the
can
options.
can I try to clarify that? Because John's confused. Although he's sort of right. Audience has been a little bit confusing. We've used AUD.
John-
We've used AUD in our own implementation and it's caused confusion with people. But the actual conflict problem that John's talking about is related to the authorization request where we have drafts that define a JWT encoded set of the parameters past the authorization request. And it also allows for the audience then is a parameter value in the JWT. So there's a collision with the audience name that I don't believe that's So that it's with respect to that initial authorization request and implicit tokens, I don't think it's applicable in the ACE world. So
I wouldn't say that actually, but yeah, it's if there's some already defined parameters. I didn't realize that, to be honest.
It's sort of implicitly defined by being a JOT claim when the claims of the JOT are used as the parameters of the request. It's a weird sort of.
That sounds indeed weird. But so I think it's perfectly fine that there's a claim with the term audience, because that goes from the authorization server all the way to the resource server, and that's exactly what we want. We essentially want the client to say, I want to talk to example.com in an audience when it goes from client to authorization server. The authorization server is supposed to then take that information, actually dump it into the token and to pass it along. This is exactly what we want.
Yeah, I understand the pattern.
Yeah.
Likely though, well, there's some issues around actually the client being able to know and convey what the actual value of the audience in the resulting token should be. That's where some of the complexity comes up, at least in the work we've done. But the problem, the actual technical conflicting problem is around the authorization server. When it says audience, that audience has multiple meanings in some context. So that's sort of the root reason that you can't use audience, at least in the broader OAuth context, as a request parameter.
But then there's no other claim that there's only one audience claim as far as I know. Yeah. There shouldn't be any confusion whatsoever.
So in JOT, the standard audience claim is defined.
And that's the one we want to reuse.
No. Well, we want to reuse that in the tokens that are issued.
Yes.
But there is a standard, two standards actually, to keep it interesting, about how to use a JOT to encode the request to the authorization endpoint. And within that, audience is part of the JOT, but it gets overloaded as a request parameter.
Are you talking about the
JAR, JWS sign or request?
Okay, yeah. Now I understand the issue.
Does that mean we would have exactly the same problem with confirmation, since confirmation is a field which can go into a JOT?
To the extent it would be used on the authorization endpoint, yes.
Yes. Is essentially the answer.
Actually, that almost sounds like maybe there's a problem with this RC that we are going to pass along, because it uses stuff in a not appropriate way.
Which RFC are you
Yet to
referring
become RC, the chart.
No, JAR uses it as defined in JOT. The problem is that we're inventing new parameters which are not those parameters and trying to call them the same name. The problem is in these new specs that are trying to overload the existing semantics. So this is the requested audience, not the audience of the token. So you just have to call it something else. This is not the confirmation method of this token. It is the requested confirmation for the token that you're going to issue me. We just have to have different names for them. Otherwise, we will create endless problems for ourselves.
Ludwig Seitz. Now I'm really confused. I want to tell the authorization server to put a certain audience and a certain confirmation key and a certain scope in my token. How do I do that? I mean, guys, you must have defined that. Honestly.
Just use a different name, Ludwig. Don't overload a JOT claim name. That's the problem, because some of the requests are going to be put in JOTs, and those claim names are already used in those JOTs. So don't call it CNF in your request. Don't call it AUD in your request. You could call it requested confirmation. You could call it requested audience. There would be no problem. Just don't use exactly the same string. Otherwise, you'll blow up signed requests.
Do you guys currently actually have that problem in your specs today? Because I believe scope is something that you can put into a request and is in a JWT.
No, it's not part of a JWT.
It is.
So it's not defined as part of the
Let's look at that.
JWT by default. So, but if you could create a problem with scope if you really worked on
Search
it.
the
So,
state up.
Yeah.
Yeah, please. And I'm gonna cut the line after Ludwig. Is
So-
that last one here?
so-
Okay. Or no. Brian, are you in the line? Yeah, after Brian.
So John Bradley, Yubico. The claims are that are part of the JOT are fine. The problem is that if you want to add if you're sending a signed request in a signed object, either a JOT or a CWT,
Dick.
because they'll both have the same problem
Dick,
because
please.
they're both defined. If you try and put some parameter of, I want you to issue a token with these things as those claims in the token you issue me, since both tokens can have both a confirmation method and an audience and a issuer, etc. If you use the same parameter names, you only have one, it's going to be a problem.
So we had this exact same problem when we were using JWTs for URI signing. And initially in the early drafts, we used the odd for something very similar to what it looks like here, and it confused implementers. And the solution was really simple. We moved it to a CDNI specific claim name that was specific to our particular purpose, and we could define it however we needed to with whatever words were useful. And it gave us the odd claim back, which we could use for actually identifying with whoever was supposed to process the token.
John, I cut the line. Sorry.
Ludwig, two quick things. First of all, I'm not opposed to rename stuff. I just want to know why. Because for me, that is more confusing. Like if I have a parameter name that is telling the OAuth authorization server to put another claim, a claim with another name into the token, that feels confusing to me. But okay, I'm not going to fight this. This is not a hill I'm going to die on. And to make matters worse, we define a scope claim. So we probably need to rename that as well, I guess. We need a scope claim in the token.
Brian Campbell again. A few things. John, proxying John, I'm sorry, it's against the rules, but the proof of possession stuff that we've done to date in OAuth, the drafts that are proceeding, mutual TLS and token binding, haven't run into this problem because the key material is implied by whatever's going on relative to that. In mutual TLS, it's the client certificate, token binding is token binding, so there's none of these parameter conflicts. It's just a point of observation. That's how the current sort of proof of possession work is proceeding.
Yeah.
The name conflicting is actually a little bit more subtle than we've talked about. Only JOT claims which are sort of meta information about the token versus like more contextual, I don't even know what to call it, subject or contextual information. So audience and CNF could potentially be conflicting to the extent that that JOT needs to be audienced to the resource or to the authorization server and might have a confirmation in it about how it's presented, although there's nothing currently defined for that. There's no scope conflict because the way that scope is being used, that it doesn't have context in a JOT of, like, it has its own context in this presentation, so it works okay. Even though scope is used in both places, it's all right. I didn't explain that well at all.
No.
It's a weird, subtle sort of overlap of when you overlay a JOT onto the authorization request, claims that have context about the validity of that JOT, audience, expiration, confirmation, potentially then override request parameters that might have the same name. So those are the ones you need to worry about. Scope doesn't have that problem.
So my conclusion from this discussion is that we have to check for the parameter names and potentially rename the ones where there's a conflict. I think
Yeah.
it's good to point that out.
Yeah, and it should be on the registry, which I think is coming soon because
Mike,
of some
Mike,
other registration issues. And
Mike-
just lastly, I wanted to point out, this will come up,
Like
that,
we got like.
that I did have the resource indicators draft, but much of that content, or at least the concepts, have been rolled into the distributed OAuth draft that Dick's going to talk about here shortly, which itself also tries to define a resource parameter. So we'll have one more place to talk about it.
Yeah. But I think that would also be confusing to reference the distributed OAuth in just for that parameter. Like it's as confusing as referencing ACE OAuth.
I don't disagree.
This,
Okay, so I guess I get the feeling that most people kind of in agreement that we don't want to use that audience parameter, and we want to call it something else. I think maybe we need a hum on that, because I see some nods, not clear about this. Maybe there is still people that are not clear on this one. So I would ask for a hum for this, and maybe just to continue with this. Is that fair enough? Go ahead.
Maybe do a hum after I present and talk about the use of resource in distributed OAuth, and then people
Okay.
can see that there's multiple places that are
Okay.
needing it.
That's fair enough. Mike?
Are you going to do the hum to adopt draft Campbell resource indicators as a working group document?
That would be one of the probably hums after that, but I just want to make sure that people understand that there is a conflict and agree there is a conflict first, right? And that's my sense of the room, that most people agree that that is the case, but I want to just make sure that this is the case, right? So maybe we should wait for Dick to present, and after that take that hum, and I'm fine with that.
okay.
Okay.
Good.
Keep going.
So that took a little longer. That was supposed to be a click-through. Okay. So the profile topic. So in ACE, the profile has a specific meaning, and it, just to summarize in case you haven't read the document, so there are different protocols being used and security mechanisms between the client and the resource server, because there are just different deployment environments. And in the way how this was approached in the ACE working group was to register a profiled string with a specification that defines exactly on what the mechanisms and what the procedures are. So for example, I listed one here, which is the DTLS co-op_DTLS profile, which as the name sort of indicates, it refers to a specific specification, and that happens to use co-op secured by DTLS, and it defines on how the keys that come out of or are associated with the Bob token are used in that to secure that exchange. That's what is called a profile. It turns out in the Bob key distribution document, we had a different parameter at that time, which was called the algorithm ALG parameter, which allows the client to tell the authorization server what parameter it is going to use or planning to use, or what it supports. Actually, on the uplink, it's what it supports, what algorithm it supports for use with the resource server. Back then, it was motivated by the work that Justin did on the HTTP signing, and it supported different algorithms. So the authorization server was basically in charge of figuring out or knowing what the common or what the resource server algorithm support is, and then it would tell first of all during the key generation, but also it would know what parameter to select. So it would basically make that determination, and it would send the corresponding parameter down to the client. That was the meaning at that time, and of course it was used with the token in context of the token type, because if the token type indicated that it was a bearer token, and that didn't make sense. So it was, if it's a Bob token, that was applicable. Jim,
Chad. I'm not sure that I actually see a conflict here. If, for example, in the ACE world, you were using a profile of OSCOR. So if co-op OSCOR is your profile, you may still want to be able to specify an alg to say which algorithm in OSCOR you want to use. So I don't know that there's necessarily a conflict in terms of that.
Okay.
Those would actually be different parameters. Right now, you couldn't specify the alg one, but that would make sense.
Okay. So maybe that's maybe the solution is not either or but both. Okay. Maybe that's a solution. Mike was objecting at least to the idea of the profile parameter. So I try to elaborate on what is actually needed to successfully establish the communication session between the client and the resource server. So first of all, there are a couple of different protocols being available, different ones used. There's the tokens come in different flavors as well. So currently we have 3 standardized token format defined in the IETF, most prominently the CWT, JWT, and then there's also for the WebRTC guy a TLB-based encoding. Then there's different security protocols. Currently, from the ACE working group, there's a DTLS/DLS. There's also an application layer OSCOR solution. There are different credential types being used, which need to be somehow indicated. And I talked about the algorithms and the parameters already. So there's quite a bit of information, and that needs to be somehow either available out of band or needs to be conveyed in the protocol exchange to make all of this work. Depending on the security protocol you use, for example, DTLS, that goes in here. DTLS can do a lot of negotiation on TLS negotiation for you, so you don't need the authorization server to pass this information along. For the profiles, some of that information is fixed, so to speak, at the specification time rather than literally negotiated during runtime. But deployments may have a different solution. So the question was, what's the story with the alg and the profile? So is the profile, Mike, you had a strong view on this, and I just heard Jim's.
Yeah, just before Mike goes on. So 5 minutes, you'll be able to wrap up, okay? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, profile is, in the OAuth world, typically something that is known by both parties via an out-of-band mechanism. I know of no deployed instances in which one OAuth client uses 2 different OAuth profiles which are selected at runtime. And the only purpose of sending this as a parameter is to select profiles at runtime. So I think that this is, not even in the 10% case, this is in the beyond the 1% case, and you should delete the parameter.
It is an optional parameter at the moment in the ACE OAuth document.
Yeah, but it's still encouraging people to think of something really complex as a normal thing to do. And I think it's a terrible thing to even attempt to do. I think it's encouraging complexity. So it should go.
And do you have
from both documents?
Do you have a perspective on the algorithm parameter as well? Would you also consider that out of band information, or would you have a different?
I would do that in discovery. I wouldn't necessarily send that.
But the discovery would be a discovery of what the authorization server supports, rather than here we are discovering what the resource server can use.
Well, if you're sending the information in a JOT, you know the algorithm because it's in the JOT.
So the client needs to know what algorithm to use for presentment in context of the presentment.
I mean, this doesn't bother me very much because it is something that it might vary, unlike the profile, which will never vary.
Okay.
John Bradley, Ubico, I largely agree with Mike. This is really a discovery and registration problem rather than a runtime decision problem. Maybe algorithm at runtime, but that also seems a bit unlikely to me. Really, we have this general problem of resource discovery and allowing the client to magically know stuff and then tell it to the server. We're just, it's turtles all the way down, unless we actually deal with how does the client figure out what it needs to do to talk to the resource server, either through the resource server or the authorization server. You're not going to have any of these parameters to specify. The only time that alg kind of makes sense is if the client itself only supports a subset of algorithms, and you might have the same client ID across multiple client instances that had different cryptographic libraries, but even that is a little bit tenuous.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I get the feeling that I guess there is no consensus on this. I see.
Can you answer the question?
I just want to let Ludwig first.
Ludwig Seitz, just one comment. You're now discussing stuff that we're doing in ACE. I would have appreciated that feedback quite a while ago when we were defining these things.
Excuse me, in October, I sent a review of the ACE OAuth spec explaining why profile was an encouragement of complexity and should be deleted because clients do not dynamically choose profiles at runtime, and the review comment was ignored by the editors. So we did say this in the ACE mailing list.
So let's
yeah, you didn't do it.
Yeah, let's move. Let's
That's ignored.
how we move forward in a good way.
So which parameters are?
Code profile and alg.
Okay. So I guess maybe we'll take a hum here. First, do people? I want to ask first if people understand the issue and if they have enough information about, and then later hum on one or the other. So the first one is just to ask if you have enough information or understand the issue, right? So if you have enough sorry.
What's the issue?
Oh, the parameters, those parameters, whether, okay.
The removal or
The-
not.
Separate questions about the two parameters because the answers are different.
Okay. Okay.
It also depends on what document is, and what working group is proceeding in. This is all irrelevant if we don't proceed with the pop key distribution.
We will proceed. There's no question.
That's a question that, another question. Yeah.
No, that's not a question.
So, yeah.
It is a working group item that is needed by two other groups, and then there's a dependency. We can of course shuffle content around. That's what we can always do. But I don't think we are now getting rid of a concept that is core in ACE and also needed with WebRTC. Or are you suggesting that, Brian, just because you don't like it?
Justin Richer, I'm not going to speak for Brian, but having something be a working group item that is needed by lots of people all over the world has not been sufficient motivation for us to actually get anything done in the past. And I am not convinced that it is still motivation. So I feel that your counter argument rings hollow given the attitude of this group in the past towards similar and in fact this exact set of problems. While I think we should probably, get our heads out from under the rocks and do this, I'm still not convinced that we are. And so I agree with Brian's statement that that is one of the open questions if we are going to do this or not. I don't think it's settled.
So just instead, yeah. So I'm trying to find out what you're actually trying to say is, I hear you say that since the work is progressing in ACE, maybe that work should altogether, that type of work, the pop key distribution work should actually be done there.
I think that ACE should solve ACE's pop key distribution work. I think that OAuth should solve OAuth's pop key distribution work, and to the extent that we can, abstract things and use common structures and common parameters and stuff, that's great.
But the problem is that when ACE was started, use OAuth because we can reuse a common mechanism across the board, and that's what we said. It wasn't we do OAuth here and then you do ACE there, because it uses a common technology.
It's not a common technology though, because OAuth is very strictly defined to HTTP, and the ACE OAuth is doing OAuth-y kind of things in a different stratum.
I disagree with that as well. It was
Then you're
initially-
wrong, I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's your perspective.
Yeah.
I could point you to a book.
I'm gonna cut
All
the
right.
line after Brian.
Sorry, man.
And go ahead.
It's Brian. I'm not even sure what to say, except that I think, to reiterate, that I don't think the issue is well understood.
Which issue?
Exactly.
No, you're saying the issue is not well understood, but don't say which issue.
But that's my point. Even what the issues are, there's not a shared consensus amongst the room.
Brian, you must be joking. I explained to you.
So hold on,
Just
guys.
because you have slides doesn't mean everyone else sees it the same way.
There's 3 questions that are open to advance the document. 3 questions, and the questions are mostly about which working group should put the content in a document. That's the issue. Yeah, how complicated is that? It's really complicated because
we'll find out.
Okay, we put stuff into the ACE document, but then we hear comments, oh, this should be done in OAuth, and then some other people come along and say, oh, we should work on this in OAuth because there's no energy, do it in ACE. Huh?
Yeah, so it's complicated.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Okay, guys. Thank you. I don't think we can take any harm today. I think we need more discussion and clarity on the issues before we take any harm. So that's my feeling here. Right, so
and that was exactly my worry, that we essentially bounce back and forth between the 2 different groups. The area directors are unfortunately not here to raise their, which I had actually asked them to do, because it's ultimately a decision about the area directors on where they want to do the work.
Right.
It's a pity.
And I would like, again, I think I cut the line. Sorry, guys. We need to move on to other topics because we are late already. Sorry.
Purely process.
Go ahead.
I understand, and I can understand why you don't want to make a decision. Not making a decision makes a decision as far as I'm concerned.
So I think,
If in terms of ACE as being an ACE chair.
my feeling is that there is confusion and not enough clarity to make a decision in the first place, and that's the reason. Okay, and that's the reason I'm hesitant to take any action right now. Thanks, Hannes. Dick. You're.
Oh, I got to click right
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, hopefully this presentation will be a little less.
I'm sure.
Clear. So I presented an early draft of this in Singapore. Anybody at Singapore saw this?
Yeah.
Because I've got some things since Singapore. Brian and Nat joined me as co-authors, incorporated, what we've been talking about here, the resource indicator context into here, and Nat had some stuff around metadata that we incorporated. So the resources, the URI in the earlier draft, it was just the host, added support for that didn't constrain it to only be client credential grants, although it's unclear how the other ones would actually work yet, or a use case for those, and then using the link header for discovery. So one of the problems we're trying to solve is in a more distributed environment, the authorization server for a resource may not be known previously, and so it's discovered at runtime, which enables you to sort of change a resource, more of a dynamic configuration. So you guys can just read that, or I can read that. Does anyone have questions on this? What the problem is? Like, here's a picture of it. And so here a client might be calling resources in really what are different geopolitical areas where there are different authorization servers for each of those regions, but the client wants to access resources in each of those regions, and so needs to go to a different authorization server. But that in this particular example, the scopes are potentially identical across all the regions. And so you're trying to have a signal for the scope that's different from where the resource is. One of the issues that comes up when you do this dynamically at runtime is there's more challenges around access token reuse. So the client potentially could be using a token to go and access a resource that it wasn't supposed to. So for example, if you got a token that says you had certain scopes, but there's no enforcement as to whether it's, say, in China or the US, right? That client potentially could access the same resource with the same scope in both places. And then another challenge, of course, is that when you have a bunch of resources, one resource could be malicious and just reuse that access token to access other resources that same client is accessing if the tokens can be used in different places. So there's two ways of solving that. And this document, we work with the first one, which is audience restricting the access token. But there's other models where you want to constrain the sender. So in audience restricted, essentially you get a token for each resource, and you use the the client needs to track which token is for which resource. And then the other examples where the parties are both a client and a resource server. So in this one, you want a sender constrained access token where there's the same access tokens used, but you want to know that whoever's calling you is the holder of that access token. So the binding is more to the caller as opposed to the binding being to the resource. So an example of that, they're NASA people, so they don't really make their stuff public, but there's a spec called UTM that all the people in the space thing are working on. So UTM is, made up of another acronym, UAS, traffic management. UAS is unmanned aircraft system. So essentially for a traffic management system for drones to talk to each other and talk back to their base about where they're flying to. And in this example, the aviation authority, such as the FAA, would be the authorization server that says who are all the people that can be operating. They want to minimize what infrastructure they run. All the operators talk to each other to communicate and coordinate flight information. So each party can call any other party. And so you want to make sure that the FAA has issued one access token to that party saying that they're authorized to participate. And then on each call, each party wants to prove that they're authorized by presenting that access token, but you don't want one party to use somebody else's access token to call other ones. That's a similar problem. How that's solved isn't covered in the current draft, and so one of the things I'm wondering is whether other people have similar use cases, whether it makes sense to put this in this, because it's another example of distributed OAuth. So in the current draft, you call the resource is how the whole flow kicks off. You call the resource, and for one response, you get two additional things that are in a link header. One is the identifier of the resource, and the other one is where to go to get information about the authorization server to go and call the authorization server. There was some feedback this morning on the list about these pieces, whether it's the full URI in Oauth server metadata URI, whether there's a better name for that. I think actually just turning it down to the issuer makes more sense on that. have some comments on that. So in this, the key thing, of course, is the client is able to know that the thing that it just called, that it matches that identifier for the resource, that the resource URI is part of the path that it called. And the identity of the resource is partly determined then by the TLS certificate in that call. Then the client goes and, from that it knows where the AS is, and it knows what URI. And so, here's our resource parameter in the access token request that we were talking about before. So we're saying that, the resource would be that URI. If we were to take that out and have that be a separate document, I don't think we'd have an issue with that. That seems to make sense if it's useful other places. And so then in the access token, it includes the URI. If that access token happens to be a JWT, then it would be the audience claim. And then when you call the resource server, you check that your resource URI is in your token. So here's the discussion points. URI for the resource. Anybody? Any questions? Any feedback?
I'll make one observation for the server metadata URI. While before the OAuth discovery spec, that would have made sense. Now we have two different formats for multi-tenant. One that's in OpenID Connect and one that's in OAuth because of path encroachment, etc. So there isn't a single URI, there isn't a single base URI that you can use if it's a multi-tenant server. So we're probably best off just specifying the whole URI, because now it's hostname.wellknown /tenant ID. So you'd have to actually have two different parameters to be able to fully specify OAuth server on a multi-tenant host. So I think it's just more straightforward to use the entire URI rather than trying to explain that to people. But other than that, that's fine.
This is Hannes. I also think it should be a URI.
Just on that, one of the threats I saw was that the resource could essentially say any URI and send the client to fetch stuff from anywhere that may not be where the AS really wants people to fetch stuff from.
That was the good thing about the OpenID Connect format. So it's hard because it was limited to the one path hop below the well-known. I mean, we would have to look at how you could constrain that or validate it with the OAuth discovery format for multi-tenant, and it's a real problem for Azure and some of the other multi-tenant host things. So something that we would have to address how that would actually work. What you have, if we just did the base URI, it would break some of the multi-tenant people, large multi-tenant people now.
I mentioned my comment, this is Hannes, earlier already on the URI, but I also agree with Mike that defining this parameter in a separate document would make much more sense because there's a lot of context with the distributed OAuth that I think is not relevant or not applicable in other environments. And then there's also the timing issue because this work has just started, and so that's why I would prefer to have it either in a separate or to just keep it in an OAuth document.
You're talking about the resource parameter.
That's not the feature. Yeah.
Mike. Wrong Mike.
So if you think this is a different resource, again, from the previous discussion, but I'm referring to what Dick said because he wanted to defer the call for that Rifat was supposed to make on the audience/resource parameter to later, because Dick thought that this would be exactly the same and equally relevant. Did I understood you correctly, Dick?
That was what I was saying. John, maybe you can clarify why you think this is a different resource.
This is the link header coming back from the resource, not the resource parameter going to the authorization endpoint. You have
No, this is one we're talking about here.
Okay, so, but that wasn't what the previous was on the previous slide. So yes, this is what he's talking about.
This is what he's talking about. yes,
Right, but
yes.
that wasn't the resource on the other slide.
Well, no, well, because this is the resource URI as it's handed in the access token request.
Yeah.
And so in the other slide, I had resource URI, which is the parameter called resource currently. Yeah.
Okay.
And everybody sits down. Okay. Any feedback on using link header? Anyone opposed to that?
It makes as much sense as anything else.
Okay.
So there was some comment on the mailing list
Yep.
about you, so do you
Yep.
want to
And
address that?
I was hoping that Nat would respond. Matt's kind of listening in on the meeting, but I was hoping Nat would respond because he had some good arguments for why link header.
So you want to take it to the list, or do you
Sure,
wanna-
we'll take that to the list.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I don't actually have a clear answer myself.
Okay.
And Matt doesn't know how to make XMPP work yet, so he can't type, but he's listening. Hi, Nat. Another comment in the list was supporting multiple resources in the access token request. Torsten had sort of talked about that. I don't know. It's unclear to me a use case where that could happen. He described a use case, but that doesn't really map into how the sort of distributed auth kicks off, which is that you call a resource and you get told where to go. So you're only dealing with one resource.
I just want to say Nat's on, by the way, in case you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is he
Wonderful.
typing anything that we can say?
Say he will respond on list.
Okay.
Great. So now we'll respond on list.
So I'm going to stick with the sort of previous position of we have refresh tokens. If you need multiple resources for a single access token, adds to the complexity. Let's just, if you need you have multiple resources, get multiple access tokens. There may be different keys or different transports or other things that you will eventually have for those resource servers. So trying to optimize it is probably counterproductive.
All right. Does anyone have a different opinion on that? Okay, well, we'll see whether Torsten can provide some crisp examples on the list. Is that Torsten?
From Phil Hunt,
Oh.
developers hate getting multiple tokens.
They hate security too.
Yeah. Okay. Developers hate doing what it is that they don't like doing.
Justin Richard, one, repeating what John said from the floor here is that developers hate security, which is marginally true. But what's more true is that most developers don't care about security, they care about functionality. And so as complex as we can make a security system, if it's too complex, they'll duct tape it open in ways that we don't anticipate. I'm not saying that's what this is destined for specifically, but but it is definitely something we need to keep in mind, especially because this is, I think, relevant to the larger resource URI discussion. You look at what happens in SAML with audience and resource URLs, and nobody knows which one means what, like ever. So I think we have to remember our history as we're choosing kind of what to call these and what they apply to.
Okay, any suggestions on different names?
Oh, I have no idea.
Okay.
So Lucy Lynch, sort of a question and a puzzlement about multiple resources in an access token. given some of the current drift towards delegation, consent, and revocation. Do you think about that in how, does that mean the entire token dies when one resource is revoked?
When one scope's
So,
revoked? or-
yes, so say one scope is withdrawn,
Then
the entire token dies?
the access token, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So it would have to be reissued with a more limited scope.
right,
Okay,
which, typically happens if a scope's revoked and you don't have, and you're using refresh tokens and the tokens are, they're valid until they expire, then usually that would happen on the refresh. But then you get a new access token with the different scopes.
I think I'm imagining a world post GDPR where you may be required to refresh quicker than you think you are.
Yeah, and so implementations do that, then do some Bloom filter so that everything can check to see whether that's a revoked access token, which forces the client to go back and refresh again right away.
All right. So to Lucy's point, we designed refresh tokens so that we could have short-lived access tokens to deal with some of these issues. Allowing, we don't want to encourage people to have long-lived access tokens that are good for multiple resources and start getting ourselves into these issues. So it's, encouraging people to properly use refresh tokens, keeping that and adding a whole bunch of gubbings for multiple resources just adds to the complexity. Yes, developers have to do a little bit more, but there are SDKs that take care of getting new, getting new access tokens off of a refresh token. It's not the end of the world for developers to have to deal with multiples.
Well, if the developer's dealing with multiple resources that have different authorization servers, they inherently have to have different access tokens anyway.
Yeah.
Right? This is sort of only an optimization if the authorization server happens to be authoritative for multiple resources. Yeah. So my last question is, the proof of possession stuff is really between the client and the resource. One of the challenges in a distributed OAuth is the authorization server reusing the client credentials at a different authorization server and impersonating the client. And so that sort of drives you to wanting to have a authentication mechanism between the client and the AS that doesn't allow the AS to impersonate the client. If the client is using the same credentials at different ASs. Right.
Ludwig Seitz,
Yes.
why not use an asymmetric POP key then? You just give the authorization server your public key, and you do the proof of possession with the private key, and then the authorization server can't impersonate you everywhere else because it only has the...
Right, but it's not, this is protecting the call to the AS, not the call to the resource.
So we do have two current asymmetric authentication methods to the token endpoint, JWT assertion. Well, then there's a SAML assertion, but we won't talk about that, and mutual TLS. Ideally, you shouldn't be using symmetric credentials in a distributed system like this. That's just going to go wrong. So yes, that's something that I've been fighting the GSMA and other people with large distributed networks. You have to bite the bullet, use asymmetric client credentials, and either use JWT assertion or mutual TLS to authenticate the client. Everything else will inevitably go wrong in some horrible way.
Yeah.
Actually,
Okay,
so
I'm gonna cut the mic after.
Just before, Hans?
no, I think if I remember correctly, in some configuration, even the JWT sort of assertion profile wouldn't help because you have to because it was more used as a bearer token, and so you could actually take that one AS could just take it and relay it to another one. So
There's an audience.
The audience would be the AS. So the AS couldn't, they could call themselves, but they couldn't call a different AS.
We thought of that.
let's check that.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was another point which is sort of in the code flow, the resource URI could be a useful piece. That seems to make sense. Although I'm still unclear of any clear use cases on the code flow. Whether we wanted to do center constrained access token, and then of course this is still ID, and is this work that's interesting for the working group, and whether we should adopt this. That's a question to the chairs.
Okay.
See if they want to put that as a question.
Yeah, so I guess we have two questions. The first one is about the resource, the audience question, and
I think the last question is the most important question.
Sure.
Because if the last question doesn't have the right answer, then the other ones are irrelevant.
okay, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so I'm gonna call then for a workgroup adoption for this document and see if there is enough support here. So if you are in favor of adopting this document as a workgroup document, hum now. If you're against, hum now. Okay, I think that's clear.
Okay.
And just for completeness, there was one hum in favor on Jabber.
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, so then quickly back to, can you go back to that slide that talks about the URI? One
Which
more?
one?
No, more. Yeah, no. Yeah, that's it. So I think the feeling got from the room that they don't want to overload that audience. So I want to ask for adoption of that document that defines the resource server or the resource as a separate or as a parameter versus overloading the audience. So if you're, go ahead, John.
I think those are slightly two different questions. One is whether or not we should be using audience or resource as a parameter. The other question is, should we adopt the other spec and back out some of the stuff that went from that spec into this spec so that this spec refers to the resource spec?
Yeah.
The name and where the work is done are sort of two different questions.
Right.
Okay.
Should we have a document that defines a parameter?
A separate document,
A separate
right?
document,
document.
to define a parameter for passing
Okay.
what someone would like to be in the audience of an issued token,
Yes.
which I think Brian's draft is a starting point for
Right.
that.
Very quick comment. What you have here in resource and what I see in the Campbell drafts is different from what is in audience. It's like in resource and in the Campbell draft, it's like URIs or URLs even. And in audience, it's more generic. So please align if you do that. If you do, go ahead with that.
Yeah, there's if we do a separate spec, we're going to have to look at what
Right.
ACE has done and other people to make sure that for the different transports, the value of the resource parameter actually makes sense for those transports, but that can be done in that spec.
Yeah.
Stefan Sanderson. I was just looking through the draft and just wondering, you have multiple resources requiring different access servers. Could you have multiple choices of how to, for one resource server, have multiple choices of where you go?
Yes.
You could,
Which authorization server? I think that's what you're referring to. Yes.
sorry, wrong
Yes.
terminology, authorization servers.
Yes.
Yes.
Which would give you resiliency.
William? Yeah,
Hey,
just
Yeah, so just on the resource topic, I guess I've heard a few different use cases for that parameter over the years. And I'm kind of wondering if all these people consider themselves to be in distributed OAuth. I think that's actually probably highly likely. So it kind of makes sense to me to do that work here. But I know like Torsten and there's a few other people that were also interested in the resource.
Okay, so why don't we do a,
Yeah.
Leave the name separate.
Okay.
Ask about the document.
Okay.
have a document defines a
Okay.
parameter to signal what should be the audience, right?
Okay, so the question is, do we need a separate document to define that
I
parameter?
think the question would be, should we adopt Brian's document?
But Brian's document is just that, and the manifestation of that, right? So is it specifically, you want to talk about that?
It's one method.
Right.
It should we adopt Brian's document as a working group document and do this work in that document?
Right.
Yes.
So that it's
Okay.
concrete.
Okay.
It's clear.
Sure.
Think about it.
Okay, fair enough. So then I'll ask about the adoption of resource indicator document. And, okay, so if, Dan?
Yeah.
So-
No.
So,
We are already over time, so we
yeah, yeah. So if you are in favor of adopting resource indicator document as a working document, please hum now. If you are against, please hum now. Okay, thank you. Thanks. We have 5 minutes here.
No, I don't think we have any more minutes. You guys.
Yeah, we only have an hour, so if you stop at 5, like we have 55 minutes, so we're.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
are. So maybe we could summarize what we.
Sure.
So I
So-
just sent a mail, you may not have seen it, to the list about asking our area directors for a little bit of guidance on the ACE, the synchronization between ACE and OAuth. I think that will be helpful.
Okay,
Something else?
yeah. So let's give him 2 minutes here.
Okay, I'm going to be quick.
Here.
The security best practices document. Okay, this is going to do something. Okay, what is it? You should already have been paying attention to this. It's an overview of the security topics, dealing with all the feedback that we've gotten from the security researchers. We've divided, based on the feedback, we've divided it up, reorganized the work. So we've got upfront recommendations and then the detailed threat analysis and proposed countermeasures. Our recommendations are exact redirect URI matching, avoiding open redirectors through various mechanisms, one-time parameters, tokens or values in the state parameter for cross-site request forgery, AS-specific redirect URIs, clients using Pixie to prevent the re-injection of code, using TLS-based methods for constraining the representment of access tokens and end-to-end TLS wherever possible. Our current status, we got some review feedback after 101. We've incorporated that into the latest version. We haven't had any Torsten's comment is reasonable feedback. Perhaps we got some unreasonable feedback. We'll have to ask Torsten what he meant by that. We have 2 proposals, which we have to decide what we're going to deal with. One about audience restriction, which we should probably add. I think that makes sense. Crypto agility. People can look at the proposal on the mail archive and decide whether or not we want to do something with that. My personal preference is that probably doesn't make immediate sense in the document. So we should decide what we do with these 2 things and then do a last call and try and move this BCP forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
That's good. Did everyone sign the blue sheet?
Okay,
Lucy, you did?
thank you all. We're done.
I had an extra minute, I could have dragged it out. I have a minute to set up. I need that minute to set up.